Everybody, and welcome to our session today for this part of the Data Center Insights virtual event. Today, we're going to be talking about securing your data center, best practices for physical security strategies. And this is sponsored by Traka, ASSA ABLOY, and ASSA ABLOY Opening Solutions US. I'm Steve Lasky. I am the editorial director of Endeavor Business Media Solutions Group, which includes SecurityInfoWatch.com, and magazines Security Business, Security Executive, and Locksmith Ledger, along with our Security DNA podcast platform. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. To begin with, let me explain how you can participate in this session. And to begin with, if you encounter any technical difficulties during the event, please submit your questions in the questions window, and our technical experts will assist you. We recommend disabling any pop-up blocking software or browser extensions, as they can cause issues with the webinar quality. Additionally, we welcome your questions during today's event. And let me stress that we want this to be interactive, so please, during the presentation, go ahead and populate your questions, and we will answer as many of those questions during the session as we can, and that will follow the Q&A session will follow the main presentation. But again, please feel free to send in your questions at any time. To do that, you simply need to type your questions into the question window on the side of your screen and hit the submit button. To refer a colleague to today's discussion, share it on social media or access event resources. Click the icon on the left side rail of your screen to do that. If you'd like to increase the size of the window on your screen, click in the upper right-hand corner. Additionally, please note that today's events are being recorded, and you'll be notified by email when the archives become available. Lastly, at the end of each session, a screen will appear asking you to complete a brief survey. We would really appreciate you to take a moment to complete this survey, because this helps us provide guidance on future content that we will be offering on other such data center events this year and into next. So let me introduce our speakers today, or our panel members. We have Craig Newell. Craig is the VP of Business Development for Traka ASSA ABLOY, and he's in our upper left there. And next to him is Chris Hobbs, Director of National Accounts for ASSA ABLOY Opening Solutions US. You can learn more about our speakers by clicking on the Meet Our Speakers tab within the webinar player. All right, so gentlemen, let's just dive right into it, I guess, here. And this is going to be sort of a different discussion, because both of you are coming from specialty and niche groups. Maybe not necessarily Chris, because you cover the broad spectrum of access control, but Craig with Traka, that certainly is true. But let's start off with a general question for the both of you first. What do you guys feel are the top physical security vulnerabilities that data centers face today, and how can they be mitigated through proactive measures? Craig, you want to start that?
Yeah, so in terms of some of the top vulnerabilities, naturally number one is access control. Making sure that you have a secure facility is number one. And perhaps Chris, you can elaborate on, dive a little deeper on that, and then I can come in on the back end on how we play a role in that in the control of physical keys and equipment as well.
Yeah, I think so. Understanding what you need to do as a business in a data center environment in terms of identifying how you want the business to operate effectively and efficiently, and also be secure at the same time, because a lot of times those two needs are at odds, frankly. So I think one of the most important pieces within the data center environment from a best practices perspective, as Craig said, is identifying the need for access control at certain levels and to execute certain purposes, all the way from the very perimeter. And we use a phrase called curb to curb. So all the way from the perimeter of the actual property to the exterior of the shell of the building, all the way down through the different layers of access that you as the business operator require, all the way down to the server rack itself. So I think identifying that, understanding that, and being able to articulate it to the design community and construction community, and then to those who have to execute from a operational or from a practitioner perspective, I think that's probably the most important thing that we see from the end users.
You know, when you're okay, go ahead.
I was just going to add, Steve, on that, and not to slant this too much in my sort of niche domain, but I think one of the things that we see quite consistently is that curb to core approach is taken, and access control and video considerations are taken, but then there are gaps. There's vulnerabilities that aren't necessarily or always identified up front, and I think it's really important to understand all the stakeholders involved in the data center operations at large and make sure they're engaged in the conversation, because you might find by speaking to another department that there is a gap there, and of course, you know, the humble physical key or a piece of equipment is often a gap in that assessment, or it's not necessarily been considered up front. So yeah, the point there is I think there's the more obvious ones that everyone tends to think of that are top of mind, but making sure you engage all of the stakeholders, everyone that's connected within the data center operation at large, and engaging them in the conversation, that will help you identify some of the potential vulnerabilities that might not be top of mind, if that makes sense.
No, that's a great point. It kind of leads me to my next question. You know, both of you guys are very consultative when you go in and you talk to integrators, when you talk to clients, and you know, in that consultative approach, when you're talking to someone and you're talking to clients or integrators on dealing with a risk assessment, what are the main points that, especially, you know, any type of critical infrastructure is going to be different than a regular business or a corporate setting, but a data center even more so. So when you're putting together a risk assessment and walking through a facility, you know, you're always looking at that layered approach from the perimeter on in. But Chris, why don't you kind of start and give us, you know, kind of the ABCs of risk assessment for an environment like this?
So for the risk assessment piece, I think there's two different, sometimes competing behaviors or practices. Number one is being able to go in and look at the facility, and is it operating and is it functioning the way that you intended it to when you designed the different layers of security, where you're granting access intentionally because you need it, and when you're denying it in other instances. So are the people and is the business operating the way that you intended it to? And sometimes that's a tough question to answer because it may not be operating efficiently and effectively. And the other piece of this, which can be very much competing, is when it's not operating or the people aren't doing things the way that you've constructed the rules, if you will, and invested in the different security layers and the products and the services and the analytics, et cetera, is then holding the folks accountable. And that can be really tough when you're dealing with third-party folks that are coming in to support you or the tenants within your sites. So it's really about, in my opinion and in my experience, it's really been about having an honest assessment and holding yourself accountable to it, but then also holding the folks accountable to it if they're propping doors open. Right. And you're getting door forced open alarms all day long. You know, there's got to be a mechanism to be able to go in and change that behavior. And I think that's probably the most effective way, frankly. but it can be a tough conversation.
Right. Craig, there's probably some folks out here, maybe a lot of folks that are listening that are not familiar with Traka, number one, and number two, are not really familiar with advanced key management and what key management really is all about. And to Chris's point, that's got to be a big part of the risk assessment, and it's generally overlooked. I mean, if you're a forward-thinking data center, you're looking at implementing electronic keys and asset management systems. So, just to kind of give our audience a little heads up, how are leading organizations managing physical keys and critical assets, with large-scale data centers being an example, and explaining a little bit about what key management is, what Traka does, and the risks of not updating your legacy key management systems.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little.
I figured you could.
Yeah, we live and breathe this area, of course. I think first of all, what's really encouraging is over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, I would say, is that the awareness of this area has increased significantly. We talked about conducting risk assessments. We've talked a little bit about access control. Those are significant and critical investments that data centers and our customers make. But sometimes the humble access control and audit of a physical key is overlooked, and that is a vulnerability. And we've seen stories of where an individual has gained access to the humble mechanical key to override that investment that's already been made on the access side, and it's caused all sorts of problems. But there's also operational efficiency gains as well by just securing, managing, and auditing your physical keys, whether they're facility building keys or indeed physical keys and override keys to the rack itself as well. So I think the encouraging thing that we've seen is that when risk assessments are being conducted, when consultants are having conversations with data center operators and end users, that the conversation on the importance of controlling access to physical keys and equipment as well is being had, and that's being included in design specifications up front. Whereas, a few years ago, it was a little bit of an afterthought. It was when something had happened, let's react and put a system in. But also where, perhaps some legacy systems have been in place that haven't been properly or fully integrated into the wider security spectrum, ecosystem, access control, etc. It was sitting in a silo, so it wasn't really being properly maintained and that sort of thing. So that perhaps gets us started on that front, Steve.
I mean, Craig, have you still today? You go into enterprise businesses and organizations still see pegboards, color-coded keys, and things like that?
Yes. So yeah, and unfortunately we do. Less so. And of course, mechanical keys are shrinking overall with the adoption increase of access control and mobile access as well. But I think what we're seeing is the management of those physical keys, the percentage of keys managed is significantly increased, because what keys are left? They're the important ones. They're the ones that you don't want to get lost or get in the wrong hands, and they're the ones that you need to ensure are secured and safe and only accessible when they need to be. So yeah, we do still see it. We see the pegboards, and but we're here to help solve for that with a more innovative solution.
Since we have a locksmith magazine, I just had to throw that in. I was curious. So Chris, I mean, when we're talking about the role that access control systems are currently playing in securing sensitive areas within a data center, how can those organizations ensure that their systems are both effective and scalable? Because again, you want to keep them future-proof, and the advancement in technologies, you want to have some flexibility in your technology growth.
Well, I tell you, so I'm going to go inside out this time. So I'll start at the, and I'm doing this for a reason, because what we see in this particular market, and I think one of the things that's interesting is going to the key management piece, frankly, is the whole industry is predicated on protecting the business operations. It's
Sure.
making that as efficient and effective and as cost effective and revenue producing as humanly possible. So the focus is equally and centrally on the interior of the business operations, and that's, I don't know if it's fair to say it's unique, but it's certainly unusual in terms of how the data center market behaves and how it's matured. So I think the biggest piece is having having a security practice and having a security platform that really coordinates the interior focus all the way down to protecting the keys that allow access to the assets themselves, whether it's a suite entry door or all the way down to the rack level. And then backing it up so to make sure that that then integrates with the access control platform that allows you entry into that suite or that hall. And then the mechanism to gain entry there, is it just a card reader or is it a card reader with biometrics? And so the different technologies that are deployed consistently, I would say, in a data center environment are unlike just about any other industry. Maybe pharmaceutical might have a similar layer of complexity and deployment of these kinds of solutions. But I think it's really interesting that everything needs to be connected, everything needs to be integrated, because it's when, I mean, anyone who's been in a data center knows that's a skeleton crew. So it has to be effective for the data center operators to be able to see every little facet of their access control, of their business operations, whatever platform they're using to measure and manage all of that. But it's really ensuring that whether it's video intrusion, key management, perimeter security and sensors, et cetera, all of that has to tie back into a single platform from a user experience so that it's efficient.
Craig, when we're talking about why key control is critical in a data center, what roles are key control systems and electronic key cabinets playing in the auditing and accountability areas, and how should they be integrated with the overall access control infrastructure that Chris was just talking about?
Yeah, so I think an integrated solution is obviously important, and making sure that you don't implement a system that sits out there in a silo, there's something else to maintain, that fundamentally, if it's not integrated, it often doesn't get well maintained, because it requires manual processes to do so. But the auditing aspect, so you've got the physical access control to the physical key or key set, or the asset that might be secured in a locker. That's one aspect, and making sure that's integrated into your access control, it allows you to set up your access rights and your clearances in exactly the same way as you would grant access to an online opening, a reader. So it creates a simple and straightforward process for the end user to grant and revoke access. But that's one element. When it comes to compliance, auditing is really, really important. You need to know who took the key or the physical piece of equipment and when, and if it wasn't brought back within a predetermined curfew period. So auditing all of that, and surfacing all of that information into your access control monitoring reporting gives you a much deeper and more granular picture of what's going on, versus if you weren't controlling or auditing what one might call an offline opening. Otherwise, we're an offline asset.
Right.
So making sure that it's key and asset management is part of that overall security picture and that it's wholly integrated, it really does close a lot of gaps, and therefore reduces vulnerabilities and risk as well in doing so.
Kind of, Craig, like building on that, when you're talking about, like you talk about the integrating it to the overall access control system, such as the badging systems, biometrics, identity management software. I mean, in your particular solution, how do you make that happen?
So quite simply, we, like others, we have a simple API interface, and we maintain those integrations, write and maintain those integrations, and we integrate directly into the access control software so that card holders and credentialing can be shared, access levels, access rights can be shared, and then events and alarms can be surfaced, and then we can drive other workflows and fun stuff. We have some of our data center customers won't allow personnel to leave until there is a check that all keys and equipment are back. Just for example, if you've got exit readers off the data center floor, you can identify, and it will query the system and go, someone's still got a key, or someone's still got a laptop or radio, or whatever it is that you do not want to risk leaving that facility. So by integrating it allows you to drive other operational workflows and solve some efficiency challenges as well. And I appreciate I'm going right down the niche of key and asset management here, Steve, and this is a wider topic. But what I'm really just highlighting is that, in our experience, there's a lot of vulnerabilities associated with the management of physical keys and physical assets that's often overlooked. But there are solutions within Traka and outside of Traka, actually, being sort of agnostic here, that can solve for that. But the key thing is making sure that it's integrated back into your identity management, your access control systems.
Now, I'm going to throw this question at both of you, but obviously, Chris, I'm going to start with you. When we're talking about layered access control strategies for data centers, what's most effective in securing a data center environment, particularly in multi-tenant or co-location facilities, which many data centers find themselves to be in? So it kind of expound on that a little bit, and then Craig, I want you to follow up.
Yeah, I think from a layered security perspective, I'll go back to our phrase that we love so much, so the curb to core. It's really making sure that you've got a stalwart defense mechanism at your perimeter of the site itself. So you have very intentional choke points, entry and exit mechanisms for your visitors and your employees and your deliveries and all the other things that are going to happen over the course of a day. So very definitely establishing and maintaining a definitive perimeter and securing that as needed with bollards and things of that nature, boulders, natural resources, or the SEPTED process of physical security. But the point is that perimeter has to be established in order to make anything inside of it effective. I recognize, I'll go into a little bit more of the layers in a second, but I recognize that in some data center environments where they're being constructed, that's just not always reasonable, right? Because of trying to comply with local jurisdictions, perhaps overcoming objections from local communities, things of that nature. So you want to soften it a little bit. So that sometimes has to be sacrificed for the greater good, if you will, to allow the data center to exist. But then you go into that next layer of still on the exterior of the building, and bollards, and again, maybe some boulder placements or some other natural barriers that help enhance or replace what you would have had at the perimeter with good fencing and walls and things of that nature. And then the last couple of pieces really revolve around the construct of that particular data center, whether it's a enterprise, hyperscaler, colo, edge. They're all going to be slightly different. But then you have a robust access and video plan at the exterior of the building. once I'm in and I'm qualified, and then allowing me to gain access all the way down to the server rack, but keeping me away from the rest. So it's really understanding what the intentions are, and the last thing I'll say is, and then be prepared for that to all change. When your business model changes, or a tenant that has 2 vaults and now wants the entirety of the building. And so all of that needs to not only be firm, but also has to be flexible to adapt to the ever-changing business environment that we all find ourselves in. And certainly the data center providers do.
And Chris, another area that probably, goes, kind of out of sight, out of mind, air conditioning and water resources at a data center are critical. Are there special access control and integrated solutions that you've dealt with that are used to protect those assets?
So it's funny you asked that. Some of the most overlooked items on the property are, well, first of all, if a substation exists on property, that gets a lot of attention necessarily, sure. And that makes all the sense in the world. Water reservoirs may or may not. One thing that is frequently overlooked is the fuel tanks on the backup generators. And it can be solved with something as unsophisticated, forgive me for those of us that sell these and manufacture these, a padlock. And not just a padlock, but a padlock that has keying solutions that's tied into the rest of your facility. So it's not something that's bought at a local hardware store. It's something that can withstand an attack. And it's something that those keys are accounted for, and they're captured in a key cabinet, so that the only time you get in those is when you're permitted to. Right. Roof hatches, there's a lot of untraditional things that experience helps us identify and account for. But you're absolutely right. Most of those pieces, because they're different scopes of work and they're different people's specialties, and going back to what Craig said earlier, it's really making sure that there's an open door relative to different stakeholders within the operation, because they will be a part of that conversation at some point, and then you'd like to be able to do it proactively instead of reactively.
Craig, when you're talking about, as we were just here, multi-entity operations, and you're segmenting different key assets out and assigning specific users or user groups for electronic or mechanical. Talk a little bit about that, on how you approach that from a layered perspective when you're dealing with basic operations like that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, when we're operating with multi-tenant data centers and our sort of colo customers, it can be quite a challenge, because it can be quite fluid in terms of the locations might be under different ownership. There's obviously different vendors that need access at different times and only to certain areas, and different expectations around when an asset might need access. So certainly the design of a key and asset management system and how it integrates is arguably more complex. I'm just thinking of a couple of our customers. They have independent access control systems at each location. So in terms of the technical aspect of integrating is a lot more complex, and what we often then look for is there a top layer identity management platform that brings those, that might be different access control systems across each location. So is there a top layer identity management that kind of brings that together? Is it better for us to integrate into that top level identity management so that we can still have the same workflows and provide the best possible customer experience. But yeah, they tend to present a few more challenges in that space than otherwise.
Okay. Chris, when again, when we're looking at how data centers can balance the need for robust security and still maintain operational efficiency, how is that done effectively, especially in terms of staff access and emergency response scenarios?
So I think having the robust security practices in place is, and this is, forgive me, my opinion, that's the overriding primary factor here. The standard operating procedures of the business are going to follow that pattern necessarily, because whether you're an enterprise or a co-location or hyper edge, regardless of whatever the type of the data center is, you have certain requirements either from your own business practice or from those that you are supporting or providing to in a tenant environment. So I think having those robust security practices is absolutely the most important piece. And because of technology and because of the normal operating behavior of a data center, there's all these natural choke points. So it actually kind of lends itself to one way to get into the property, one way to get out, one way to get in the data center, maybe a few to get out in the event of emergency, but there's primarily one way in and one way out, regardless of whether you're an employee or a visitor. And then you have secure portals. I know we're not supposed to use the term man trap anymore, but so there's all of these different mechanisms in place. And because of what the data center is there to do, and because of how they're operated, it actually lends itself to, I think, really effective security practices and procedures. So it feels like it's pretty normal and natural the way that the different robust security practices are put into place. It doesn't feel like you're asking folks to do something unusual or uncommon. It's a representation of the same behavior all the way from the street to the server rack. So I feel like it's pretty consistent.
Yeah, Craig, what can you add to that? Because I mean, you guys are bringing something to the table here with a dual approach. It's supporting compliance standards that you got to deal with, like ISO 27001, and all these. You've got to document who was accessed and when, where, and why. So, explain a little bit about that. Playing off of what Chris just said.
Yeah, sorry, Steve. I actually missed the first part of your question before Chris answered because I had an audio issue. Can you just maybe?
Yeah, just talking about how Chris was just talking about layered approach here and different ways of gaining physical entry. But again, if you're talking about a dual control approach that directly supports compliance standards now, which is important, such as the ISO and the SSAE standards, documenting who, what, and where, and why. Talk a little bit about why that's important to you guys.
Yeah, and actually that makes me think of a related subject matter as well. We've talked a lot about controlling who can gain access to certain areas of the facility at what levels. But actually, there's also, it's as important to make sure that there's certain contents that someone might be carrying into a data center cannot get access to a sensitive area. And coming back to the sort of risk assessment point of earlier, I think what's encouraging is that that's being increasingly factored in, and then technology is starting to be adopted and thankfully integrated into the overall security picture on how to do that. And a simple example might be making sure that you might not be allowed to take a cell phone or a certain communication device or a laptop or something like that to a certain area within that facility. So how do you prevent that from happening? Well, you obviously need to create a procedure for that. Perhaps there's an electronic locker that allows you to temporarily deposit your personnel contents or vendors' contents. The old way of doing that might be it might be a shelf, it might be a mechanical locker, but it's something that's not easily audited. So by having an electronic locker and having a procedure for a vendor or an employee that might be coming in, and they know, right, I'm not allowed to take this piece of equipment or this device into this area of the facility, I have to identify myself to the locker and deposit that device or that contents in the locker. And then bringing it back to the compliance pit side is that there's an automated audit trail in that. And again, all that information could be surfaced into your, it might not be into your access control, it might be another system where you're keeping all of these records. But then when there's an audit conducted, you've got all of that granular information to say, hey, we're following our processes. We've created these standard operating procedures for employees, contractors, vendors, and actually here's evidence that we are following those processes and doing what we said we were going to do. And I think when organizations do that provides a lot of confidence. If you've got a colo operator that are adopting these practices and these technologies and creating these processes and digitizing them, that gives confidence to their clients that, hey, my data's in good hands, as it were. So
good point. Chris, when we're looking at how organizations handle role-based access and visitor management, especially when vendors or contractors require short-term emergency access, in your mind, and Craig, I'm going to want you to answer this too. In your mind, what are the best practices for handling this situation?
Well, I think the biggest piece is kind of sticking to your guns, frankly. It can be a challenge because there's an awful lot of requirements tied to escorts. So even if you're a familiar face from a trusted company, the policy says that you need to be escorted, so you will be escorted. And maybe there's a mechanism by which I can prove myself over a period of time or in some manner where I'm not deemed a risk, but that's up to the business to decide whether that's even an option, and if so, what does that look like? But I think the biggest piece, frankly, is having those policies and procedures and then standing by them. And even if it means using technology. So maybe you cut me loose to go do my job, and you've established that I can only go down a certain path to a certain point, and you can validate that through whether it's the access control or video verification, biometrics, et cetera, all the different technological tools that we have, but really just using that technology and ensuring that I was where I was supposed to be and when I said I was going to be, and I went nowhere else and did nothing else. So I think forgive me, I think the biggest piece is putting the rules, if you will, in place, abiding by them, and leveraging technology whenever humanly possible so that it can actually be feasible for the business to operate. I mean, like Craig mentioned earlier about you can't leave until all those keys are accounted for. That's holding somebody accountable. And they're probably not going to make that mistake more than once or twice. And then they're going to make sure that everything is accounted for because it's the end of their day and their job is complete, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that's the biggest piece.
That's a great point. And Craig, probably many security managers don't consider key control and management when they're developing their visitor management plans. Do you think that's a mistake, and why, and how can you help?
Yeah, I think again, 5-7 years ago, it may not have been a consideration, and I think it is increasingly so. But at the end of the day, the key or the piece of equipment may have the ability to override that investment and the access control and video and everything else that you're doing. So you have to take that holistic approach and make sure that it is a consideration. And yeah, that's, I don't know if I've got really any more to add on that, but I think just making sure that key in asset management and the integration into access control and you're looking at it as at the big picture is really, really critical, because otherwise you're going to be open to vulnerabilities, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Chris, when you're looking at how entrance security can be designed, and it's got to be balanced to a rigorous protection and also the need for operational efficiency and minimal disruption for the folks that work there. How do you balance security and efficiency when it comes down to smart design and integration for your systems in a situation like a data center?
So I would say, depending upon the particular opening and the access point across the campus, in some cases, they're exposed to a particular type of weather or the potential for a particular type of weather. So that needs to be accounted for. But I think the biggest piece is understanding that you want people, once someone has arrived at the site and you've allowed them on to the site itself because they're qualified, just designing in the simple tools, I'm saying simple, excuse me, the simple tools and again, the technologies that aren't complicated and aren't terribly expensive anymore, frankly. Things like an IP intercom, so that people can communicate over space, but from within the site, to say, okay, well, we're going to let you in the vestibule, but now you're not going anywhere until someone comes to greet you and to let you go any further into the facility. But I think just understanding that those are two entirely different openings. One, I'm going to call it a soft opening, because you want someone to get in out of the weather. You want your employees to be able to get into the facility and have a seamless experience, but you also want to create a gate for me so that I have to stop here and I can't proceed until I can go any further. And then that next layer in particular, I think, is probably the most important one based upon the work that we've done with our customers. And that's getting into the secure area of the facility. And I'm not even talking about getting into necessarily the server rooms yet or the main data halls, but really just going from that main entry area into what I'll call the secure side or the secure area of the facility, and having something that's robust, anti-tailgating. Again, it can be a really smooth, seamless experience for an employee who should just roll right through. But it allows for you or the data center operator and company to have a really nice secure environment there with the security portal, with anti-tailgating, maybe a couple of sensors if you're looking for things in particular. But I think that's probably the most critical piece is that step there, and then certainly beyond getting into the data halls and the server rack areas.
Craig, AI is increasingly being used to detect suspicious behaviors like loitering and tailgating and unauthorized access through video analytics and pattern recognition, and it's being accompanied in data collection for access control systems. Yeah. But for Traka, how can Traka help here when we're talking about some of these advanced technologies?
Yeah, I think the obviously the AI buzzword, it's become the top of everyone's mind right now. But I think having it all comes back to leveraging data and making sure there aren't any gaps in that data spectrum. So, looking across all of your technology, all of your systems, and not necessarily just security systems, by the way, but your other operational systems that are used throughout your facilities, and how can we best leverage that data to identify patterns of behavior, identify trends that allow us to close gaps in our operational procedures, increase efficiencies, and of course close vulnerabilities and security. So I think tying it back to why I believe it's so important to engage stakeholders and operational folk within the space that may sit outside of security, because I think they bring a lot to the party, as does security bring a lot to the operations side of the house. Because I think if we can look at our technology and our systems and what data those own, is often a gold mine of information that, if that can be surfaced into a program and queried, it allows us to design better processes and as I said, identify patterns of behavior. It might be even down to how we lay out the facility and how we design the facility. So I think that's a very sort of 30,000 foot. I appreciate, the key and asset management piece comes in there by making sure it's just one of those technologies that's integrated into that's auditing events, auditing information, and contributes to that big data picture, really, if that makes any sense, Steve.
That's a great point. And it leads me to what, Chris, as far as when we're talking about best practices for integrating physical security systems, whether they be access control, video, intrusion detection, analytics, and also cybersecurity. How do you build that into a unified, future-proof security architecture from the get-go? I mean, these are things that, because they're so sophisticated now, it's a little tough to, start adding on to legacy systems. But when you're building out, and I know data centers are going up, like weeds. I mean, here in the South Atlanta area, we've got 3 huge data centers going up within the next year. And so how do we integrate all those solutions to make a comprehensive security plan?
So I don't think anyone will ever say future-proofed and with any kind of confidence or without a little bit of a smile on their face.
Right.
Because we whether you've been doing this for 5 minutes or 5 years or 5 decades, it's just that it's not a realistic thing to say out loud or to try to convince someone of. Having said that, though, having enterprise level solutions that are, I think that's the key factor, regardless of the size of the business. As long as you're considering enterprise solutions, then you're going to position yourself in the best possible manner. And obviously, any experiences that you or others that you trust have had, there are not just some, there's any number of subject matter experts that support the data center environment that have seen and been a part of the mistakes that have been made to learn from them so that they can advise the clients. But the biggest piece is getting in front of it from a standards perspective, so that when the facilities are built, they're built to the requirements and expectations. So having all of that baked in on the front end. And I love contradicting myself. So it's critically important to have rules that you stand by, but also the flexibility, because businesses change, new technologies come out, or maybe a new iteration of an existing technology. So there has to be definitive standards and requirements, but also have the flexibility and the foresight to be able to look at something that could actually achieve what you're trying to do, maybe a little bit more efficiently or wildly better. But I definitely think that getting way in front of it by having definitive standards and applying them to the facilities, maybe going back into existing when it's reasonable, but specifically to address anything coming, that's the most effective thing that we've seen our customers be able to to achieve what they're trying to achieve is in the process and program. And it's not always the sexiest thing to do, but it's really, really effective.
As we look at this, and I don't want to throw this out to both of you, Chris, I want you to kind of continue with your train of thought. As the threats evolve and attackers become more sophisticated, what sort of innovations are you looking for in physical security that are on the horizon that you think could significantly change how data centers in particular are protected, but critical infrastructure in general?
I hate to say it, but hardened facilities. It's the world we live in. It doesn't matter whether I like it or any of us like it or not, but in some instances, hardened facilities, which means taking things up a notch or two relative to protecting the actual building itself. And it could be a forced entry opening or a bullet resistant or blast resistant, depending upon what the circumstances are. The other piece and this is something that we do and that others do as a manufacturer, is EM and RF shielding or sound transmissions to control. So there are so many different iterations, but I definitely think that has become, instead of the exception to the rule, it's become much more prevalent in the data center customers we've been working with, in particular with the hardened openings, and even into the interior, all the way down to putting access control on server racks. So it's really been interesting and dynamic as far as how that has changed and how it's going to continue to change, because the bad guys are getting smarter or luckier or both. And so we have to try to keep a step ahead of them.
From your perspective, Craig, what's in the future for your folks and the solutions that you're providing?
It's a focus on how we can extend what we're doing in the security space to provide added and additional value on the operational side of the data center. Just touching on the sort of cyber aspect and a vulnerability, is, we've had some conversations with customers around the process of ensuring a robust process of when, say, a vendor has come in to work on a server or a piece of equipment. Maybe they need to change out a drive or something like that. Well, what happens to that drive? Does it just go on a shelf? Does it just get taken out in a bag? What process is there to make sure that data remains safe and doesn't get into the wrong hands? So one solution that we're expanding upon right now is the ability to have an audited exchange of custody of that drive, that information, through a electronic deposit locker, so that it's deposited in the locker, it is secure, there's an electronic audit trail, and then only certain personnel can then retrieve that and take it off site for arrays, dispose, whatever that process might look like. But again, not to labour a point, but making sure that is fully integrated into your security systems, so you've got that full audit trail of what that process looks like. So that's just one avenue. But how do we get there? How do we get to those conversations? It's by engaging all the stakeholders that are involved, and identifying where those problems are, where those pain points are, and saying, hey, we've got technology, perhaps even existing technology, that can be leveraged to solve for this problem. And that's really interesting, because I think you can, if you look at your access control system, and if that's integrated, you're getting more and more and more out of your access control system, and it's adding value into so many other areas of your operations now, which is I think that's a great thing.
I agree. I'll tell you, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so that's a great way and a great spot to end our conversation today. Unless anybody has any questions, we got a couple of minutes left, but I don't see any questions in the queue. And if we don't have any now, we're probably going to go ahead and close out for today. So that concludes our presentation today, and I want to thank Craig Newell and Chris Hobbs for participating in this data center event. Our sponsors for this event were Traka, ASSA ABLOY, and ASSA ABLOY Opening Solutions US. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We had a great crowd, great live crowd today, and most of you stayed on for the entirety. So you were listening intently, just not asking questions. So that's fine. We appreciate that. Once again, please take a moment to complete the survey that will appear after this session concludes. We appreciate your time in completing this brief survey, and as it will help us provide guidance for our future content for these data center events. Again, don't miss our next session, which you can join by exiting out of this session and going back into the agenda and clicking on a link there. And that would be the view session button. So again, Chris, Craig, I want to thank both of you. Great stuff, and hope you enjoyed the afternoon, and we will talk to you again. Hopefully we'll probably see both of you at GSX.
For sure. Thank you,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye.